Over the next 2 days, Britain will try and make deals with Commonwealth partners in London as a last-ditch attempt at finding trade partnerships to replace what may be lost when the UK leaves the European Union. Trade Secretary Liam Fox has said the United Kingdom is one of the few countries in the European Union that does not need to bury its 20th century history. Dubbed Empire 2.0 by its critics, the talks with Commonwealth trade ministers being initiated tomorrow by Theresa May's government come just as a disturbing account of UK atrocities in the Jewel of the Crown that became the Commonwealth is published. The book is called Inglorious Empire: What the British Did to India. Its author, the Indian politician and former UN diplomat Shashi Tharoor, joins me now. Shashi, thanks so much for coming.
Good to be with you, Afshin. Yeah.
You implicitly compare the British Empire to the Nazis when you talk about atonement, how Chancellor Willy Brandt knelt at the Warsaw Ghetto. Take us through some of the atrocities.
Gosh, there were plenty of them, I'm afraid. I mean, there were the direct atrocities, the actual killings of people. 100,000 were butchered in Delhi in reprisals for the Indian Revolt of 1857, the following year.
35 million, you said.
35 million Indians died in totally unnecessary famines because of British policy. The British had an active philosophy that they will not intervene in famines. Number one, the free market principles had to apply. Number two, Malthusian logic said if the land couldn't support the population that was supposed to support it, then let people die. And number three was the Victorian principle, thou shalt not spend money thou hast not budgeted for. So on all these grounds, the British approach was not to help in famines, and where India had traditionally had a culture of charity where the rulers aided people in times of drought and other kinds of agrarian distress, what we saw with the British was a policy in which people were carelessly allowed to die, and what is worse, when the British they exported grain from the very places that people were starving in order to fill the markets in London. Equally appalling, when somebody tried to help, they were prevented from doing so. And I've recounted instances in which even a few kindly Englishmen were essentially threatened with deportation back home if they helped the people who were dying of starvation. Great Bengal famine, 4.3 million people killed on the basis of explicit decisions made by Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister. Churchill ordered grain to be shipped out of Bengal while people were starving. When Australian ships laden with wheat showed up on the port of Calcutta, they were not allowed to disembark their wheat. They were ordered to sail on to Europe, not to feed sturdy Tommies, Churchill's phrase, but to augment the buffer stocks in the likelihood of a future possible invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. And when conscience-stricken British officials said people are dying on the streets because of your decisions, all Churchill could do was to write peevishly on the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man
this is Boris Johnson's hero, by the way.
I mean, this is the man the British hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy. I find it revolting. This is a man who stands alongside Hitler, Stalin and Mao with some of the worst leaders with blood on their hands in the 20th century.
There's no excuse whatsoever for the prevailing racism to excuse Churchill's conduct on that basis.
Well, I mean, is racism something you ever want to excuse? He dismissed all Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion, forgetting we had several beastly religions, actually. When confronted with news of the famine, he said, "Oh, the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis matters much less than that of sturdy Tommies." And this was the kind of language he was prone to. He wanted the viceroy to sit on an elephant and trample Mahatma Gandhi into the dust. He was just a very odious piece of work, this man.
Education is, in a way, in the heart of this book, because certainly I, as a third generation, not sure, Indian, growing up here in Britain, was told, no, the point is the empire brought modernity to India. India
was one of the most prosperous countries in the world. In 1700, it was the richest country in the world, with 27% of global GDP when Britain had 1.8%. In 200 years of British rule, plunder and spoliation, it was reduced to one of the poorest countries in the world. The Mughal Emperor, the last big Mughal Emperor, Aurangzeb, had revenues that exceeded those of all the crowned heads of Europe combined, including Britain. When English people cynically say, well, it's not our fault that you missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution, my answer is we missed the bus because you threw us under its wheels. The British came in, destroyed the thriving textile industry, destroyed the thriving shipbuilding industry, destroyed the thriving steel industry, and I've given examples and details about all of this, and substituted their products into what had become a captive market held down by force of arms. It really was not exactly a monument to free trade or democratic principles.
They didn't bring the Industrial Revolution to India.
No, on the contrary, they tried to prevent it coming to India so that they could continue sending to India the products of the dark satanic mills of Lancashire and Dundee.
And let's actually just go to John Stuart Mill, since you just mentioned Mills. He doesn't come off very well, nor does Kipling. What about the ignorance of the rulers and the elite classes that are worshipped in the pantheon here of great Englishmen?
Well, I think the big problem with
Scottishmen.
with the English generally was that the fine, high-minded liberal principles they applied to themselves somehow faltered at the racial divide. In other words, everything that was good for them was somehow not good enough for the Indians. And in their desire to instruct the Indians on their own inferiority, we have things like Lord Macaulay saying that all the works of learning in both India and Arabia could not replace the value of a single English book. I mean, this sort of nonsense, the arrogance that came out essentially out of ignorance and racism combined.
You go so far as to say Kipling was sort of genocidal propaganda, some of it?
Well, Kipling was certainly a racist propagandist. Genocide, up to a point, he certainly was. I mean, genocide is a word I don't use lightly.
You used to work at the UN.
Exactly, but certainly he gave a lot of cover to murder and oppression of the so-called lesser breeds, as he called them, the brown and black people of both Africa and India. And I'll never forgive or forget the fact that when the odious psychopath General Dyer killed people in Jallianwala Bagh, the Amritsar massacre, coldly, clinically, without any excuse, without any provocation, without issuing any warning, and thereafter inflicted the most vile racist abuse on them. For example, not letting families tend to the dead, the dying and the wounded for 24 hours while their bodies rotted in the sun, ordering Indians to crawl on their bellies on a neighboring street and have their heads bashed in if they so much as lifted their heads while crawling. All of these appalling things. Dyer was celebrated by the House of Lords here, condemned by the House of Commons, I'm glad to say, but celebrated by the Lords. Money was raised to reward him for his murders. He was given the equivalent of what's £250,000 in today's money by the British people of that time. And Kipling, that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, hailed him as the man who saved India. Saved whom in India? Saved what in India? For whom?
If India was, as you quote in the book, the glittering jewel of the medieval world, how is it so easy for the British to do this to India? I mean, you quote Stalin as saying he found it ridiculous of you Englishmen to dominate India.
Well, there were two principal factors. One was certainly our own political disunity and a wonderful tendency to put our own personal interests ahead of those of any larger allegiance or loyalty. And so people were quite willing to pay the British East India Company to replace the people they were nominally loyal to on the thrones. But apart from that, there was also superior technology. The British had artillery and guns which were superior to those available in India, and they had techniques of military formation that made their forces more effective in nimble movements than the somewhat lumbering and large elephant-laden forces of the Indians. The Indians often would bring out 3 or 4 times as many people onto the battlefield, but they would be fleeing in disarray because of the somewhat lithe and nimble military tactics that the British used on Indian soil. Nobody is innocent in an enterprise of colonialism. There are always people who will see that it is to their advantage or their family's advantage to cooperate with the colonizer, and many did.
You demolish one argument after another, Clive, of India's reputation, a free press being brought there, a unified India. You also talk about Jeremy Corbyn earlier in the book. What is it about what he said about our colonial past?
No, it's simply that I had made the argument that Britain should really teach its own colonial history to its children. It's shocking that you can do A-levels in history in England today and not learn a single line of colonial history. So I believe a journalist asked him about this. He was quoted in a couple of the British papers as responding that, yes, he would like to see the real history of the British Raj being taught to English students. That hasn't happened yet, and it's a crying shame. In fact, the week the book came out in India, a Pakistani journalist wrote an article in The Guardian about having raised 2 children here, best public school, Westminster. They studied history, didn't learn anything about the British Raj. Why this historical amnesia? Why the desire to brush these things under the carpet? It's often more convenient not to remember atrocities. The Germans went through a similar period of trying to brush everything under the carpet immediately after the Second World War. My German friends of my age, or slightly older, were simply not told anything by their parents about their involvement in the war and what they actually did. But by about 1980 or so, there was a sea change. And now German schoolchildren are bused to the concentration camps to see for themselves the kinds of things that were done by the Nazis, so never again would get some real meaning. But also, I think, for English people today, to know what accounts for the world they see around them. How do you read Jane Austen without being conscious of the lifestyle she describes?
Well, I was just going to get on just briefly and finally. Yeah. Can some excuse be made for the fact that, I mean, India may be one of the fastest growing economies in the world? here at home in Britain, we are suffering some of the worst austerity for generations. Surely taking refuge in a romanticized idea of colonialism is certainly where TV drama, for instance, is going, and is some sort of refuge in it amplifies almost the.
Look, I don't object to TV drama, gauzy, romanticized notions through rose-tinted spectacles, provided it, at some more serious level, such as your history lessons in school, you actually learn the accurate, larger picture. Because yes, you're right. I mean, TV shows are entertainment, and no one wants to be made to feel bad. They won't tune in. So you want to make them feel good and wallow up all this wonderful luxury. But the truth is that in reality, the luxury was built on the oppression of the people who were serving you to make that luxury possible.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you.
Thank you, Afshin.
The UK's Foreign Office responded to the allegations made in this interview with:
As two modern democracies, UK and India have a long-standing friendship and work closely together to promote our shared prosperity and global security. Our friendship is characterised by extensive political engagement and deep economic cooperation.